thank you very much. Perhaps you'd just like to explain for everyone who you are and what your relationship is to A. Griffith.
Right, yes. So my name is John Griffith. I'm the third child and only son of Alan Arnold Griffith, and I was born in 1938, towards the end of his time at the RAE. I am not an engineer, I'm a physicist, and so any interest in aeronautical engineering that I have is purely amateur.
Something that I was very interested in when you sent through some information was that I had no idea that his father had been a science fiction writer.
Yes.
Which I found quite interesting.
My father had quite an unusual childhood. My father, A. Griffith, was born in 1893, actually born as Alan Arnold Jones. His father then worked as a journalist for Pearson's Weekly in London, and Pearson's Weekly decided that they should have a weekly serial, as did the Strand magazine famously. They were looking around for someone to write it, and George Griffith, my grandfather, who was then George Jones, said, "I'll do it." So he set about writing a serial which became his first novel, The Angel of the Revolution, which was about war in the air. Now this was written in 1893, before any powered flight had occurred. He then changed his name a year after my father was born from Jones to Griffith, because he said nobody called Jones was ever famous. And he wrote under the name of George Griffith, and of course my father hence became Alan Arnold Griffith. It's worth saying for the record, people often get my father's name wrong in two ways. They put an S on the end, to which he objected very strongly, and secondly, they call him either Alan or Arnold, and he was never known as that in the family or to friends. He was always known as Griff. He was born then in 1893. His father rapidly became very successful as a late Victorian author, writing largely what were known as future war novels, we would call science fiction. And he made quite a lot of money. They moved successively to more and more upmarket houses in London, then to Littlehampton. And then eventually, however, my grandfather's popularity began to wane. He became less popular than H.G. Wells. His books didn't sell so well, and also, sadly, my grandfather tended to drink quite a lot of the profits. So they moved to the Isle of Man to live more cheaply, and lived in, I think, a small cottage in the Isle of Man. Before very much longer, in 1906, my grandfather died of liver disease, not surprisingly, leaving the family with almost no money. So my father, his sister Muriel, and their mother went to live with their aunt, who ran a boarding house in Douglas, Isle of Man. My father was then 13 when his father died. So Griff then went to Douglas High School, where he was a very talented pupil, won a scholarship to Liverpool University to study mechanical engineering, where he went at the age of 18 in 1911. So he got his first degree in 1914, his master's degree in 1915. The First World War was then in progress, and he would have been called up or even volunteered for the services, but family anecdotes say he was simply too thin and was passed medically unfit. And therefore he was drafted into war work at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, which was then the Royal Aircraft Factory, and it was a major production outlet for aircraft at that time. Initially he was put to work in the mechanical engineering workshops, where he did too well out of the piecework system by thinking about how jobs should be done. So he was fairly quickly moved to the research department. In the research department he worked for G.I. Taylor, who was himself a great scientist, not only in engineering but in physics as well, and large numbers of papers in both areas. An aside that I will just quickly put in there is that when I did my PhD in physics, I had to do some work on the flow of liquids, and the reference paper that I had to use for this particular type of liquid flow was written by G.I. Taylor, who was then quite an elderly man, but so he was my father's supervisor in the research department. The first job my father was given, as far as I know, was to study the distribution of torsional stress across structural members of aircraft of arbitrary shape. Now today you would simply download a computer program which would knock off the calculation in a very short time, but in those days you couldn't do that. If you wanted to do it by calculation, it would be done by hand, and very, very laborious techniques to solve the equation that described the distribution of stress across an arbitrary cross-section. But he came up with the idea that you could solve the equation by blowing a bubble. And the reason you could do this was that the equation obeyed by torsional stress was the same as the equation obeyed by a bubble blown across a hole of the same cross-section as the member you were trying to study. And so in other words, it was a very early kind of analog computer. You would cut a hole in a plate of the appropriate shape, blow a bubble across it, measure the bubble, and that gave you the distribution of the stress. So that earned him the name of Bubble Griffith at an early stage. They then went on to study why things break at all. And clearly this was a problem. At that time, aircraft didn't have much power. They were made very light. You had to cut down weight as much as possible by making the structure as thin as possible, and then of course quite often it broke and you lost a pilot as well as the aircraft. So it was very important to understand why things broke. And it is said that, and this is purely anecdotal, that my father went to G.I. Taylor and said, "What should I do next?" And Taylor, who was a very busy man at the time, said, "Oh, go and find out why glass breaks." And it was an interesting question, a very perceptive question, because if you calculate the forces between atoms, you can calculate how strong material should be. And although this was at a very, very early stage of the atomic theory, really very early, they could estimate the forces between atoms, and therefore you could estimate how strong a material should be. And most things break at a stress or strain which is much less than you would expect from the forces between atoms. And that was an unsolved problem. So my father was told to go away and think about that. And he solved the problem by realising that material, once it's had even modest handling, has minute surface cracks on it. And if you now say stretch a piece of glass or a piece of steel, whatever, these cracks on the surface begin to open up. And initially, to put it in simple terms, you have to supply energy to create a new surface. But at the same time, you are releasing strain energy from within the body of the material. And sooner or later, you get to a point where the strain energy is being released faster than you require energy to create a new surface, and then you get catastrophic braking. Fine to have that idea, but he then went on to formulate a theory, mathematical theory, based on thermodynamic arguments for how this can explain the strength of materials. And he wrote a paper called The Theory of Rupture, which I think was published in 1922, just past the centenary of that. And that was published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. And that, in fact, has become probably his most enduring legacy. The work continued at the RAE in Farnborough, and again, this is an anecdote. I was told this story at a centenary conference to celebrate my father's work, given by the Institute of Materials in 1993, on the centenary of my father's birth. At the conference I met a number of old-timers who had worked in the early days of this work, and they told me the following story, that he was working on this theory of rupture by doing experiments on glass, which is a very good experimental material for this purpose. One day his laboratory assistant left a gas jet burning and burned down the hut where they were doing this work. There was, of course, some sort of committee of inquiry because some ministry property had been destroyed, and they asked him, what work were you doing in this hut? So he said, I'm investigating how glass breaks, to which the obvious reply was, what use is that to the aircraft industry? And the work was stopped. And he was moved into the engine division of the RAE. The work on the breakage of materials based on this theory was not taken up again seriously till around 1952-53, and is now the basis of the entire science of fracture mechanics.
I remember the whole thing of thin fibres was covered in quite a lot of depth by one of our set texts in first year, which was Gordon's book, I think is The New Science of Strong Materials.
That's right. I will tell you an amusing anecdote there. My father never told me anything about this work. I knew nothing about it at all. Until when I was a physics student, I commuted every day from Farnborough to London University where I was studying. Like to pass the time on the long train journey, I used to buy a paperback book. And I bought a paperback book by Gordon, one of the, I think, a Pelican series, on the strength of materials, just out of interest. I sat reading this book on the train, and the name Griffith kept appearing, and it dawned on me it was my father. And all through this book there were references to Griffith crack theory. When I became I still didn't realise quite how valuable it was. I became a lecturer in physics at Birmingham University eventually, and one of my colleagues was a solid state theorist. And he happened to be at the physics stores one day standing next to me, and he said, "Are you by any chance the son of the Griffith crack?" And I said, "Yes, indeed I am." And then I began to realise that loads of people knew about it. And my final point on this, which I must put in the middle of the 1980s, the government of the day became very keen to try and measure how valuable British university research was. And so we all had to find out what the impact of our research work was. I was working in nuclear physics. And the way to do that, of course, was to see how many citations your papers have received. So I toddled off to the university library, took down the citation index, which in those days was a big printed book, not on a computer, found my entry in the citation index, and I looked up one of my papers, and there I saw J.A.R. Griffith and my paper and 6 citations. And I happened to notice that the facing page of the citation index, which is a huge volume, was absolutely covered in citations for one paper with no heading. I thought, wow, that must be something good. Turned the page back to see who it was, A. Griffith, Theory of Rupture. So 60 years after he wrote that paper, it was getting hundreds of citations a year. Far, far more than mine will ever get. And indeed, a colleague drew my attention a few years later to the fact that the paper had featured in the citation index as one of the star papers of the year, as still getting huge numbers of citations years and years after it was written, on a par with Einstein. So that's the theory of rupture. Is that enough on that one? Maybe?
Yes, I think so.
I think where we go from there, and again, remember my father never told me this himself. He never spoke about his work. I think the secrecy was deeply embedded, and his idea on secrecy was the way to keep something secret is not to tell anyone you're doing it. So he just didn't talk about his work. However, lots of people have talked to me since. And so what happened then was he was moved, as I said, into the engine division at the RAE, and where they were, of course, working on the developments of piston engines. But he got interested in the possibility of gas turbines being a propulsive unit for an aeroplane. Gas turbines were not new things, so they were built as industrial units, and they were huge and heavy, and you wouldn't think of putting them in an aeroplane. But he got into thinking about gas turbines, and within 2 or 3 years of joining the engine division, he had realised that the reason gas turbines were not very efficient was that they were running with their blades in a stalled state, and that if you wanted to get an efficient turbine or an efficient axial compressor, the blades had to be treated as aerofoils, and you had to avoid them stalling. And he wrote an internal report for the RAE called An Aerodynamic Theory of Turbine Design, which was written in 1926. You might like to note that that's 3 years before Whittle even appeared on the scene. And this led to a research project at the RAE where they built a turbo compressor unit to test the efficiency for the turbine and an axial compressor. How it worked, in fact, was that an air pump was used to suck on the turbine, and the turbine drove the compressor. So it wasn't an engine. But what they did was to measure the efficiency of these single-stage turbine, single-stage compressor, and found that the results did indeed, after some tests, correspond with my father's prediction that they could be 90% efficient. This led to a proposal to develop a gas turbine jet engine. Now, in parallel with this, Whittle, who was then an Air Force cadet, wrote his thesis proposing a jet engine to propel aircraft. And that was, I think, in 1929, going entirely from memory. My father was, of course, then already known as an expert on turbines and compressors, and he had been seconded for 3 years from RAE to the Air Ministry Laboratory in South Kensington, and Whittle's proposal was sent to him for examination. my father spotted two mathematical errors in Whittle's calculations. Remember, Whittle was a young chap, engineering cadet, I think, in the RAF. And also he thought the proposal, some of the assumptions in the proposal were over-optimistic. Whittle, in his own book, Jet, admits he did get a couple of mathematical errors. So this is being now presented by, particularly by journalists and broadcasters, as suggesting that somehow my father was professionally jealous of Whittle, did everything he could to put a stop to his work. But no one suggesting that could possibly ever have met my father or talked to anyone who knew him, because he was absolutely not into self-promotion. He hated publicity, quite unlike Whittle in that respect, who loved it. My father avoided publicity at all costs. He would not give lectures. He liked to work on his own, think ahead, think to the future, and his mindset was, let someone else do the development work. So, whereas I think Frank Whittle very much, he was obviously a very bright man, and but he had very much the inventor mentality. This is my baby, and I want, to take care of it all the way through. But in fact, I mean, historically, both Whittle's proposal and a separate proposal from the RAE for an axial turbojet were put to the Aeronautical Research Council towards the end of them, around, 1929, 1930, and they were both turned down. So not only was Whittle's work stopped, but the RAE's work was stopped as well. And both were restarted in 1936, when the RAE was allowed to restart turbojet research, and Whittle, of course, founded the Power Jets Company, and the two went on off in parallel. I won't go into all of that history. I can recommend Hermione Gifford's book to anyone who wants to see what happened next, as it were. But I want to stress it is absolutely impossible that my father would have tried to stop somebody else's work. It was not his mentality. He was interested in things being advanced. And the one thing I would say about him, he did believe in getting his sums right, as I discovered when I was a boy, when occasionally he helped me with mathematics. And he believed you should make sure they were right. Of course, historically what happened after that, RAE started a program of developing an axial flow turbojet. Whittle, who had by this time been sent to Cambridge University by the RAF and would have acquired the sort of thermodynamics knowledge he needed to promote things, he went along the route of the centrifugal compressor, which was easier to build at the time, but my father always believed that an axial flow compressor was the only sensible answer for a jet engine. And of course he was right in that, because there aren't many centrifugal compressors flying today. He also believed that, I suppose again, there was a different point of view in what you wanted a gas turbine for. Whittle's unique contribution was to suggest that you could propel the aircraft with the efflux from the jet, from the turbine. Whereas my father clearly envisaged a core turbine engine driving either a ducted fan or a propeller. It greatly amused me, a few years ago, Jeremy Clarkson did a programme on Whittle, and in order to demonstrate how good the jet engine was, he got the BBC to fly him all the way around the world. And it was worth noting that every single aircraft he flew on was propelled by an axial flow jet engine driving a turbofan. Every single one. In other words, essentially a Griffith design. My father continued to work at RAE until 1939, a year after I was born. The RAE wanted to make him a senior manager. He always told them that if they tried to promote him to management, he would leave, because he was a scientist. He left, and he was recruited by Hives at Rolls-Royce, who gave him this wonderful historic job description. He just said, carry on thinking. What else could you ask for? And he was given a personal office tucked away in his rather theoretical ideas into something people could make. And that's how they worked for the rest of his time at Rolls-Royce, from 1939 to about 1960, I guess. Donald Eyre has documented very closely everything that he worked on, and that is available from the Rolls-Royce Heritage Trust as a book, his sort of memoir. So if you've not seen that, it's well worth looking at it. And you will find all kinds of things in there. For example, in 1941, my father was sketching out a scheme for jet lift with vectored thrust, which became a Harrier about 12 years later, or no longer than that, 15. All sorts of ideas kept coming. Some of them were good, some of them weren't. The first engine that Rolls-Royce made to my father's design, the CR1, was not a success practically, but the CR2 did run, I think. But this was a complicated contraflow system with contra-rotating discs, turbines and compressors on them. That never went into any sort of production. He later got on. He was responsible for designing what became the Avon jet engine, I think initially known as the RA-13 or something like that, which developed into the Avon. And his attitude to his work was well illustrated by an anecdote I was told by people at Rolls-Royce when I visited there once. It seems that in the early days of the Avon engine, they were having quite a lot of trouble with it. And they went back to my father to ask for his advice. Of course, he was now thinking of something quite different. And he just said, that's why we've got development engineers. And of course, it's part of the ethos of Rolls-Royce that it achieved what it achieved by steady development, of making things work over sometimes many, many years. And that was the story of the Merlin engine, for example. So he then sketched out other schemes. The Conway bypass engine was one of his, and so it went on. I suppose the next big development that became well known was the so-called flying bedstead, which Rolls-Royce termed their thrust measuring rig. And this was a device to show that you could lift a craft off vertically on the efflux of jet engines and keep it stable in flight. So it was the pilot, the original test pilot, was a Group Captain Shepherd, who was brought out of retirement to fly the thing because he was known as an extremely skillful test pilot who could literally fly by the seat of his pants. And you had to have a feel for this thing to avoid it killing you. But so he sat on top of two Neen engines, which blasted downwards over at Hucknall, just north of Nottingham, and it was stabilised by four outriggers that used air bled from the compressors, and a servo mechanism to stabilise the thing in flight. And that flew in 1953, I think, and was an absolute sensation when it became known to the public. Here is an aeroplane with no wings. First of all, we have them with no propeller, now we have them with no wings. And this thing lifting off, it was all over the papers. And my father's name, of course, was directly associated with it. So the press wanted to interview him. He wouldn't have anything to do with it at all. And I remember he was at home in Farnborough one weekend around this time when it was big news. And the phone rang, my mother answered it, and it was a newspaper reporter from one of the big dailies. She was terribly excited to have the newspapers come online. And she handed the phone to my father, who said, "I never speak to the press," and put the phone down. His argument was that if you gave an interview over the phone, there was no record of it, they could say what they liked in the paper, there was no comeback. So that's another example of him not being interested in self-promotion at all.
Did he ever consider writing a technical memoir?
Not that I'm aware of, no. He was actually a very good writer. He was quite a literary man. He could quote Shakespeare, and he could speak, in his younger days, he could speak French and German fluently. But he never had any inclination to write down. It's something about his mentality. I think he lost interest in the project once it was done. So around that time, once the flying bedstead demonstrated the fact that you could stably support on lift jets, they then went on, he proposed a scheme for flight in which you would have dedicated lift jets. And this was demonstrated with the short SC-1, which had 4 Rolls-Royce SAW jets pointing downwards, or RB-108s. They were pointing downwards and one pointing backwards, and it could make the transition from vertical to horizontal flight. So that was the next stage after the flying bedstead. And he had a proposal for a supersonic airliner, which was shaped somewhat like Concorde, but it didn't need the droop snoot, of course, because it would lift off vertically. And it didn't need the problem of takeoff and landing with a very narrow delta. So it would lift off on its lift jets and then switch to horizontal ones for supersonic flight. That never came to fruition. And the argument was, well, the lift jets are useless when you're not flying, and they're dead weight, but then so is an undercarriage, and so is the mechanism for drooping the snoot of the Concorde. It's a difficult argument, and I don't think it was ever really resolved before people realised there wasn't a future for supersonic travel because people wouldn't stomach the noise on the ground. That which was what squashed Concorde, of course. As soon as you couldn't fly overland across America, it was finished. That was the main problem with it. We had our holiday home down in Devon, if you remember, in the early days when we were first there and Concorde was still flying. It used to start going supersonic over the channel and nearly blow the windows in. So that was what came next. Towards the end of his career, he was contemplating types of propulsion that, as far as I know, have never been realised. One thing he did tell me about, just not long before he died, he was thinking about a scheme in which an aircraft would be propelled by hydrogen burned outside the aircraft, essentially an external engine. I couldn't quite understand how that worked, but he was injecting hydrogen into the shock wave or something of that sort. Other things he worked on, you might come across in the literature the Griffith aerofoil,
I don't know it, I'm afraid.
No, the Griffith aerofoil was a laminar flow aerofoil with where you sucked on the boundary layer, and it gave very high lift and very low drag. And it was, I'm not an expert on aerodynamics, so I don't understand the details, but they did in fact build a glider to test the idea, and it was tested out in Woomera in Australia. The problem they had was, because it depended on laminar flow, the surface had to be very clean, and Woomera was full of mosquitoes, of course, which stuck to the front, so you had to scrub the thing every time you flew it. But the idea worked, but I don't think it's ever been used, apart from, I think, blown aerofoils are in use for short takeoff and landing aircraft. No, that was something that was worked on way back, probably in the 1940s. What else can I tell you?
Do you think your father's natural proclivities towards engineering, were they, do you think, always visible from a very early age, or did he happen upon engineering as he grew up a little bit?
Well, again, I was told a sort of story about third hand, that when he was a child on the Isle of Man, he built a working model helicopter and powered it up, and it was so successful he lost it. So he's often sometimes viewed by by journalists as being a head in the air theoretician who was not very practical. And that's not true, because he did have workshop experience. He could, in his later years, he could go to a lathe and turn off a piece quite easily. He also had quite extraordinary ability to visualise three-dimensional objects from third angle projection drawings. And again, this is a story people from Rolls-Royce told me. He once was walking around the design shop, the main design shop in Rolls-Royce, with some visiting party, and a young designer showed him a design that he had made for some sub-assembly of an engine. And apparently my father looked at the drawings, he glanced at them, he said, "It's very nice," he said, "but it's impossible to assemble it." Because he could visualise it in 3 dimensions. And when they came to study it in more detail, yes, indeed, that was true. It was nicely designed, but you couldn't put it together. My sister and I used to give him a puzzle at Christmas every year. You can buy these puzzles which are made up of complicated shaped bits of plastic, and they assembled into a stellated dodecahedron or something. We would give him one, but we wouldn't give him the box. We'd just give him a handful of pieces. And he would step outside the room, and a minute or two later come back with the thing assembled. He didn't even know what it was supposed to be. He just had this ability to visualise things, which I certainly don't have.
Was he always a very serious man, or did he have a sense of humour?
He had a very good sense of humour. He liked plays on words. Sometimes they used to drive the family mad with these. A favourite one when we were going on holiday as children and we were stuck in a traffic jam going very slowly, and then he would see a sign saying "road works ahead," and he would say, "I think the road's gaining on us." Things like that. And he loved puns, spoonerisms, and he could be quite sociable. When he was at the RAE, he had quite a reputation for drinking pints of beer in tune to the strokes of Big Ben, and I've no idea whether that's really true, but again, another anecdote. And the other thing which perhaps doesn't fit in with this very serious nature, he was quite a demon driver. In his early years, in the 1920s, he had a seneschal French voiturette racer, which he used to race around the roads of Hampshire, sometimes competitively with friends. A friend of his had also had a sports car, and one day they had a challenge to race to Staines Bridge and back to see who would win. Of course, there wasn't much traffic then, and his friend actually ended up in the back of a removal van because they were going side by side through a village, and had the ramp down, he went straight into it. So he had his wild side as well. But when you probably gathered from what I've been saying that we continued as a family to live in Farnborough, even though he was working for Rolls-Royce in Derby, because we lived in Derby for just 1 year early in the war. In August 1940, the Germans attacked the RAE. It's the only time they did. But because we were in line with the main runway, one of the bombs dropped at the bottom of our garden, damaged our house quite seriously. And also my father thought, it's obviously too dangerous here, you know. So we temporarily moved out and lived on a farm near Henley for a few weeks, and then he found us a place up in Corndon near Derby, where we lived for a year. But my mother was Farnborough born and bred. Her family were Farnborough born and bred for God knows how many generations, and she just did not like the Midlands. In addition to which, they started bombing the Midlands shortly after we arrived, and so the decision was that Farnborough was going to be safe after all. They never attacked it again. So we moved back to Farnborough after a year, and my father stayed in a lodging house in Derby, and used to come home when he could. And after the war, it just continued. He'd come home every other week. Well, towards the end of that time, Rolls-Royce thought he ought to have a car. Unfortunately, not a Rolls-Royce, but they provided him with a Humber Hawk. So he used to drive from Derby to Farnborough for the weekend, and he would set off at about something like 5 a.m. on Monday morning, and would get to Derby in 3 hours. There were no motorways then. I'm talking 1950s. He had plotted himself a route with Ordnance Survey maps. Part of the route involved stopping to open a farm gate, apparently. But he obviously used to drive absolutely flat out. The only way he could have achieved that time. Quite extraordinary, really.
Do you think there were any mentors he had, either at university or in work, who were particularly influential on shaping him? Or do you think that the core of Griffith was always there and it just came out with time? I mean, thinking of the gas turbine work, I believe there was in his time as a student, there was a professor at Liverpool with an interest in it. And it's quite possible that's where some of the inspiration came. I'm sure G.I. Taylor must have been an inspiration to him. He was quite an extraordinary man, really. He ended up eventually he was a distinguished professor at Cambridge and was knighted. So he was Sir Geoffrey Taylor eventually. But very influential in a number of fields, and still working as a research worker very late in life. So he must have been part of the inspiration. One thing I must tell you about this, when my father died, it was 1963, my mother asked me to go through his papers. Now, one thing I've inherited from him is a chaotic attitude to paperwork. You can laugh. And
So there were two drawers at home, one in the bottom of the sideboard, an old sideboard with a huge drawer, packed with paper. And he had one upstairs in the bedroom, which was also packed with paper. And a lot of those were useful things, like reprints of his paper on the theory of rupture, for example. One thing I found among his papers was this, which is a patent application from 1867 for an aerial apparatus. And in here there is a description of a proposed aircraft. The structure resembles something that we would call a hang glider, a sort of triangular wing by the look of it. But in the paper they suggest that it could be propelled by jet propulsion. And you could in fact fit two jets either side of the cabin, and you could have movable jets for steering the apparatus. So there you were, 1867, a proposal for jet propulsion with vectored thrust.
It's incredible.
Yes, and that was in his papers. So when he acquired that, I don't know. Now, he and Whittle were both on the Gas Turbine Collaboration Committee, which was set up by the Ministry of Aircraft Production during the war to develop gas turbines in wartime. And it's perhaps worth saying a bit more about those early developments, because Whittle, of course, founded Power Jets with a certain amount of private money, but he was largely funded by the government. And the story that somehow the government didn't support him is frankly ridiculous, because I mean they built him a complete factory in Lutterworth, for example, at a time when building was extremely difficult. So, you know, in the popular imagination, people like a story where an inventor struggles against the odds, and everyone's against him, the whole world's against him, and somehow he wins through in the end. It's a good story. It's never really like that, is it? Not very often, anyway.
I began to have suspicions when I'd been reading a lot of RAE paperwork, and also a lot of there are some very good historical surveys that were written by sort of top RAE staff, or interviews of them post-war, and there are quite a few mentions of Griffith.
That's quite good.
Ah, thank you. I'll have to have a look at that. And I didn't really get the feeling from reading any of those that the Griffith-Whittle story, as I'll put it, by which I mean the stereotypical thing that you've discussed, had been what had happened at all. It really seemed to be that Griffith's opposition to the centrifugal layout was purely just that he didn't think it was the correct technical choice. Exactly,
and which of course has proved right by history. So that's, but I mean, you could take Whittle's point at the time. It was pretty difficult to build axial compressors, but it's worth following up. You know what happened at the RAE after my father left. The work was directed by Hayne Constant. Now that's a name which ought to feature much more in this history, because Hayne Constant developed a practical proposal for an axial turbojet at the RAE, and it was built by Metropolitan Vickers eventually, and I think there were two versions, the F1 and the F2. The F1 I think ran only on a test bed. The F2 was flight tested in a Gloucester Meteor before the end of the war, and it morphed into the Armstrong-Siddeley Sapphire, which was a very successful post-war engine. It was eclipsed by the Rolls-Royce Avon engine, because the Avon Rolls-Royce just had more push behind them. But in some respects the Sapphire was a better engine. You may know the story that fighter planes with with Avon engines in them, the Hunter and then later the Lightning, suffered from a problem. The engine stalled when you fired the guns, which is slightly embarrassing in a fighter jet. The Avon was prone to stalling, to I think it's called compressor stalling, I mean, you would know. And its problem was actually cured by the test team over at Hucknall, here in Nottingham, by devising a way of preventing that happening. The Sapphire was not liable to stalling, so that was a good design, and it came directly, I believe, from the RAE's work, and it's hardly mentioned at all in the histories.
And presumably Constant would have taken a substantial amount of the kick-off from that, from Griffiths.
Yes, well, they worked together, you see, for a while. And Constant, I think he left the RAE for a while, went back into academe, and then came back to the RAE. I mean, I'm not sure of his biography, but I think he might have been an applied mathematician by training. A bit like Stanley Hooker, of course, who went to Rolls-Royce and then Bristol, who was not an engineer, but an applied maths man.
I was very interested to see the early work on engine fuel injection control that Griffith had done and published a paper on in 1931.
That was RAE engine division, yes.
He seems to have been a bit of a polymath in terms of, it's quite unusual to see so many different fingers in pies.
Yes.
Is that a fair comment?
It is a fair comment. I mean, if you think about the way the strength of materials came about with that work, he could easily have turned into a physicist. He could have been a solid-state physicist. No question about it. He probably would have been a very good one too. But, no, it's just the way, how does someone's career develop? Lots of random things happen.
I mean, if perhaps we've already covered it, but if he was here now, in this room, I know this is a bit of a difficult one to answer, but what do you think he would want people listening to this to know that you maybe haven't already said? Is that a bit of a difficult question? It is
a difficult question because I'm not sure how he would have answered it, to be honest. I really am not. Yes. I think he would probably see, the work he had done as his legacy, but it's not something he ever went on about. He didn't care for honours very much. I mean, he was a fellow of the Royal Society, and I knew that meant a lot to him. And I'm guessing that the primary reason for that was probably his work on materials, but I don't know. But so he was a fellow of the Royal Society, and that was he considered a great honour. He was awarded the CBE. Now, I'm pretty sure he would have turned that down, but for the fact that my mother opened the letter from the Prime Minister. The letter arrived with a heading on it, and of course my mother couldn't help but open it, and no way was he going to turn down a CBE once she'd seen it. But he wasn't someone who valued honours. I think he quite enjoyed the day of going to see the King, but, as I did at the age of 10. But he didn't go for it. He was awarded the Blériot Medal of the Royal Aeronautical Society. The Richard Ferry and Louis... No, not Blériot, Breguet. Yes, the Richard Ferry and Louis Breguet trophy. We've got a replica of it upstairs somewhere. And I think, he enjoyed that, because that was being honoured by fellow aeronauts, as it were.
It was interesting that you said that you had only discovered many aspects of his work as you yourself were going through the technical world, reading, finding his name in books and so on.
Yes.
Does that suggest that your path into physics was, in a large part, your own one, and that, or did you feel particularly inspired by him to get into the technical world?
I was certainly inspired by him to be a scientist, yes. I suppose what really got me into physics was an very early interest in electronics. From, about the age of 10, I started to get interested in, thermionic valves and how they worked and that kind of thing, and building circuits, jamming my mother's television set by building a transmitter upstairs, that kind of thing. So I got interested in physics and did a physics degree, and moved on to PhD in nuclear physics, and then did 40 years research in it, in one way or another. But we were saying how I was saying earlier, you never quite know what turn your career will take. I was doing accelerator physics. I was working on medium energy nuclear physics using charged particle beams. We had cyclotrons at Birmingham University, which I was using. But we were being told that we would have to switch our work to a national nuclear structure facility being built at Daresbury. That would where all the funding would go. So this was a different sort of nuclear physics, and I didn't know much about that branch. So I took a year's sabbatical in the University of Minnesota, where they had a similar accelerator to the one being built in Daresbury. And so I went over to Minnesota intending to learn that sort of nuclear physics. When I arrived there, I discovered that their accelerator was in tiny pieces all over the floor because they'd been having big trouble with it. On the other hand, they had just taken delivery of a dye laser, which was a very new device at the time, in the mid-70s. A tunable dye laser which could be tuned with great precision into atomic transitions. And I just got interested in this thing and did an experiment with it instead of doing accelerator physics, and completely changed the direction of my career as a result of that random incident. I worked with lasers for the rest of my life on doing atomic physics with them.
I don't know anything about dye lasers. What's the fundamental difference between that and say a carbon dioxide laser?
That's pretty simple. Okay, the dye laser, it's a visible laser, the visible light. The early ones worked around the red, yellow, green region of the spectrum. The point about it is you can tune it to a specific optical frequency, and you can smoothly tune it to a chosen wavelength or frequency, and it's a very, very narrow band. That is, it's if you think about it, what's the frequency of light? It's some 5 × 10 to the 14 hertz or something like that. You can get this bandwidth down to a megahertz without any trouble. So it's 1 part in 5 × 10 to the 8.
How is the tuning done?
It's done by a number of optical components in the laser cavity. And the dye provides gain over a wide range of frequencies, and therefore you have to select out the frequency you want using interferometers and so on within the cavity. They are fiddly things to use, an absolute nightmare sometimes, but when you get them working, they're very good. What that means is you can tune them into a particular atomic transition. Like, for example, the first one we worked on was the sodium yellow line, because it's easy to get at. You can tune in to that, and you can see the hyperfine structure in it. You can resolve very, very fine hyperfine structure in the sodium D line just by scanning the laser through it and looking at the scattered light that comes off from the sodium vapour. The particular application we used this for was nuclear physics, As you know, nuclei come in different isotopes, and different isotopes have different masses, but they also have slightly different nuclear sizes, and that affects very slightly, very slightly, the position of the atomic spectral lines. So when you look at a material, I mean, for example, one of the first ones we studied was samarium. It has many isotopes, and the spectral lines are all in very slightly different places, but very close together. And by using our techniques, we could resolve them, measure the splitting caused by the fact that the nucleus is a slightly different size for each isotope, and therefore we can measure the nuclear sizes. And that's what I did for the rest of my career, finishing up working in the University of Jyväskylä in Finland, where they have good facilities for producing the isotopes. But that was the kind of thing. But no doubt I was inspired to become a scientist by my father. Yes, I mean, he was a figure to look up to.
So I'm particularly interested in education as a pet interest of mine, in terms of all the aspects of it. Looking back at your physics studies, do you think the program you studied prepared you well enough to go and start real work, or did you find that you had to teach yourself an awful lot that you thought you ought to have been taught in the degree program?
Okay, I think that I can answer, because it was a problem I had to face as a lecturer too. Throughout my life at University of Birmingham. What can we put in the course? You can't teach people everything. We once had a committee in the department in Birmingham where we were supposed to try and decide the core syllabus that everyone should do. And everyone on the committee went away and wrote down the bits from their particular subject that they thought were absolutely essential. When we brought them all together, virtually you had the whole of physics, and the degree would have taken 20 years, So you can't teach everything, it's impossible. What you do have to teach is method. And I think what the undergraduate course I did at King's College in London was in that way very good indeed. They taught us to think, to ask questions, and they were very hot on experimental work, doing real lab work and analysing it properly, understanding experimental errors and statistics and so on, making sure you knew what was going on in the world, as it were, and that you didn't end up with false results. And that grounding was very good indeed. There were great holes in my knowledge. I mean, for example, I obviously studied thermodynamics, but I find my father's work quite tricky to understand. I studied thermodynamics up to the end of the second year and could do all the standard stuff, second law and all that kind of thing, but I never used it in my life subsequently. And therefore, whereas atomic and quantum physics I've used throughout my life, and I have a very good feel for that, insofar as anyone does. And anyone who says they understand quantum physics is lying or deluded. But when you come to do research work, there are certain areas which you work on quite intensively. I was really, I suppose, a closet electronic engineer at heart. And a lot of the stuff I did in experimental physics was solving problems using electronics. I had a particular love of servo mechanisms, which somehow worked their way into everything I did. So really, that's my work was mainly experimental physics, and the techniques I learned early on certainly stood me in good stead. I mean, I liked measuring things accurately, and so spent a lot of my life trying to do it. So I suppose, but in an undergraduate course, what worries me a bit about modern courses is a lot of them are taught online. Fair enough, you can get through a lot of material, but I regard learning in a university as a social interaction process, and it's best done face to face, really. You need a good relationship with the students. And from my way of thinking in physics, real practical work is essential, absolutely essential. Otherwise you can't, even if you're going to do theoretical physics, you need a grounding to understand what is possible and what isn't, and what you should believe and what you shouldn't, from experimental work. That's my feeling anyway.
And would that be your chief criticism of modern programmes, or is there anything else?
Well, you see, experimental work is expensive. You have to have a dedicated laboratory. In Birmingham we had a laboratory for every separate year, and sub-laboratories within those for different areas. And those labs are not used all that much. The students in a given year perhaps do a whole day a week, and maybe you take them in 3 groups. So that room is being used 18 hours a week. Now, if you're a bean counter in the central office of the university, you think, this is ridiculous, surely we can double up and put 2 years in the same lab. But then, of course, you've got to pay technicians to switch all the apparatus over from one to the other. So it is expensive. And the apparatus is expensive. If you're going to train people to use modern gamma ray detectors, for example, in a 3rd-year nuclear physics lab, you've got to buy them. They're not cheap. And, so the temptation to try and do it by simulation is very great. We had a computer expert in the department who believed that you really could do away with the labs altogether, and he could write programs which would simulate experiments, including experiments going wrong. But it isn't the same. It really isn't the same. You can't get a feel for real apparatus and real measurement unless you do it, in my opinion.
I remember going to a lecture in Oxford and being told at the end of the lecture that they had been doing a computer simulation of water molecules freezing, and I'm going from memory here, but I think he said it had taken about 6 months on a supercomputer to simulate one frozen particle of ice. So,
of course, the trouble is they had chosen one of the most difficult problems on Earth, because ice has numerous different phases depending on the temperature, the pressure, and God knows what. So it's a very, very complicated material. We had I only know that because we had an expert on glaciology in our department in Birmingham, who used to spend his summer going out to glaciers and sticking poles in them and then measuring the poles' movement. Yeah.
So we've only got a few minutes left. Just as a closing thing, something I tend to try to ask most people that I'm interviewing is, some people ask this question in a roundabout way and they say, oh, what advice do you have for your younger self? But I prefer to say, what advice would you have for a young student who's maybe in the final year or 2 of their studies and are going to be going on towards graduating and going into industry or research? Do you have any advice?
I have only one bit of advice, because I often got asked that by 3rd-year students, my tutorial groups. I used to tell them, think of something you really enjoy doing and then find someone who'll pay you to do it. The size of the salary doesn't matter that much. You've got to be happy doing it. Because, back when I was teaching in physics, there was a huge vogue for physics graduates to go into finance. Banks were recruiting as many as they could get. Often they were making them redundant by the 30s, but they had big salaries. They could you could get a good student going to work for a bank and getting the salary of a professor, well, you know, from the beginning. But if he doesn't enjoy the work, what's the point? So that's what I would say. Think of something you enjoy doing and find someone to pay you to do it.
Okay, that's good advice, I think. Is there anything I haven't asked you which I ought to have asked?
Can you think of anything, Harvey? No. Just to go back to the Griffith-Whittle thing. It's quite interesting. I have Whittle's book Jet, which was the first thing that was really written about the story, written entirely from his point of view. But he didn't seem to have any resentment to my father at all in that book. Sorry, pardon me. He just stated, you know, what happened. And the fact that the RAE and Whittle projects were stopped at the same time by the Aeronautical Research Council speaks volumes as far as I'm concerned. It wasn't a question of one being stopped at the expense of the other. I think there's a story of Whittle and the jet. Who was it? John Gollan, was it, who wrote? Gollan, is that the name? One of the very first books. I've got a copy, I should know, but anyway. He was the first person, I think, to suggest that it was professional jealousy. I think everyone else has picked it up from that.
Okay. That certainly ties in with the research that I've done, which happens to have overlapped with Griffith's work.
Yeah.
So it just remains to say thank you very much for your time.
Well, I hope I've not spoken too much.
Agreeing to be interviewed. No, it's perfect. The memory card has 5 minutes remaining.